The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally. An important part of leading a healthy lifestyle is supporting a strong, healthy heart. Being proactive in taking care of your health may require more than just exercise and a healthy diet. AOR's Cardio Mag is the ideal supplement for those looking to proactively support healthy magnesium levels. This formula contains true, fully reacted magnesium orotate. Magnesium is known to be an important mineral for the heart, while orotic acid is, in addition to being a carrier for magnesium, also has heart health benefits such as supporting cellular repair, cardiac energy stores, energy levels, and protein synthesis. Get yours today at your local retailer or online at aor.ca or aor.us. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Supplementing Health. Long QT syndrome is a condition in which repolarization of the heart after a heartbeat is affected. It results in an increased risk of irregular heartbeat, which can result in fainting, drowning, seizures, or sudden death. Catherine Stanford is the author of Lightning Flower, My Journey to Uncover the Cost of Saving a Life, and has long QT syndrome herself. She is here today to share her experience and expertise on the condition. Welcome, Catherine. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm actually on chapter 10 of your book right now. I was hoping to finish it before our conversation, but life has unfortunately gotten in the way there. But in there, I think you do a really great job of explaining how the heart is supposed to work and the way that it is altered when you have long QT syndrome. So would you mind sharing that for our listeners?
Sure. Part of the fun of being both a writer and someone with a very technical heart condition is that I've had to spend a lot of time trying to make something that's very technical understandable to lay people. Long QT syndrome is a heart condition in which the heart can end up quivering instead of pumping blood. So essentially, our heart is normally engaging in a kind of synchronized pumping action that is occurring because of electrical currents that tell certain parts of the heart when it's time to do certain things. And normally that synchronized electrical current that results in a synchronized pumping gets blood into the lungs to become oxygenated and then sends that oxygenated blood out into the body at the kind of rate that allows our organs to do what they need to do. So we remain conscious, we remain able to move, all of our organs can do whatever our bodies need them to. With long QT syndrome, there's a particular part of the heartbeat that becomes longer than normal, as you might imagine from the name. So the QT interval of the heartbeat refers to the repolarization interval. Every time the heart beats, it is sending that electrical signal to different parts of the heart to muscularly contract. And when that signal gets a little bit unsynchronized or takes too long, sometimes parts of the heart are ready to fire and other parts of the heart like haven't gotten the memo yet. And so what ends up happening is a loss of that synchronization. The heart is pumping, but it's not pumping in the neat sequence that really powerfully sends oxygenated blood around the body. And so with that quivering instead of pumping, parts of our body may not get oxygen, and that is going to look like passing out for some people. Maybe they're lucky and the lack of oxygenation doesn't last that long, and so they don't actually go into cardiac arrest. But often folks who die of sudden cardiac death are dying of cardiac arrest from that blood not getting out appropriately. So long QT syndrome is fundamentally a problem with this repolarization interval. And long QT is a little tricky in that it's not that by having long QT syndrome, you suddenly have a repolarization interval that just takes the same amount of time, even though it's long. Like, it's always changing. It's always responding to things in the exterior environment or what you're choosing to do with your body. So the type of long QT syndrome that my younger sister and I have is known as type 2, and it is specifically related to the potassium channel in the heart. And that type of long QT tends to get exacerbated by emotional intensity or being startled. Often it's related to epinephrine or adrenaline in the body. So for us, it's not that it's necessarily dangerous to like go for a run. It's more dangerous to go for a run and be startled by a bear.
Right.
My younger sister started going into cardiac arrest when her roommate's alarm clock would go off, and other people have had trouble like when a car horn honks at them. In my story, I pass out in a parking lot at age 24 because my cell phone goes off. So these are not necessarily like external triggers that you can entirely prevent, although definitely there are things that we can do that affect when long QT shows up in the body.
Those are all such everyday things, things that we totally take for granted. I mean, maybe not being startled by a bear in the woods for everyone, but, a cell phone going off, a siren outside, those sorts of things, they're things we totally take for granted and in a lot of ways bring so much positivity into our lives, but
Mhm.
obviously not when you have a condition like your own.
That's exactly right. Yeah, there was a funny moment when I was first diagnosed that an ambulance passed me. And I was like, how ridiculous is it that the sound of the ambulance could be the thing that makes me need an ambulance? I mean, it's just, it really underlines in a disturbing way the sort of chaos that exists in all of our human lives that I think we don't always have to think about or attend to. Normally we get to sort of proceed through our day as though we're safe and we put on the seatbelt or we are careful not to take too many ibuprofen or like whatever it is we think we're making decisions that improve our safety. But there is a way that some of these conditions remind you that we're just not in control of all factors.
Absolutely. And so you and your sister both have the condition, and I know your sister was diagnosed quite young. Was it at age 24 that you got your diagnosis, or was it prior to that?
It was at age 24. So my sister was 18 and a freshman at University of Colorado at Boulder when she began going into cardiac arrest in her dorm room. And we did not know why she was passing out. Of course, you might imagine with college freshmen, my parents' first response was a little closer to like, were you drunk? And as time went on and it happened a few more times, she did have some tests around like, is it a seizure? Like, what's happening? And she ended up getting, I suppose you could say, lucky. The whole situation obviously is not lucky, but she was in a health clinic because of some flu-like symptoms, which often can be related to heart health difficulties in women. And she had an event actually at the school health clinic, and they were able to transfer her to the hospital. And in the hospital is where she was actually hooked up on a machine when she had another event, and that allowed the rhythm to be captured and a nurse on staff to say, oh, this looks like we may need to have a cardiologist look at it. So my younger sister had her first implanted cardiac defibrillator placed in December of that year. So at the end of her first semester of college, that was in 2007. And I lived in Wyoming at the time, about 500 miles away. We weren't super close. I didn't go home for Christmas that year because I was working as a ski instructor. And so I really only saw her maybe once in a year and a half, maybe twice. But she also, being so young and having the personality she has, she wasn't sharing a lot about her experience. And so to me, it very much felt like, okay, my sister got diagnosed with this thing and I don't, like, it's kind of solved because now she has an ICD. And I knew my parents really wanted me to go in and have an electrocardiogram done to look at my own heartbeat. And that was something they were all doing in Illinois, where I grew up. But I was uninsured, and as you know, a 22 and 23-year-old at the time of my sister's events, I was, yeah, uninsured and working as a ski instructor and climbing guide, and just really not feeling like it made sense to walk into a hospital and say, hi, can I pay out of pocket for an electrocardiogram? I think, like so many young people, I was just really steeped in the myth of my own immortality or invincibility and was super healthy. So I didn't ever have an EKG. And then on June 19th, 2009, I had just gotten back from a hike and I went to band practice. And as my guitarist and I were sort of getting going, a phone call came in that I really needed to take. So I grabbed my phone and I ran outside, and that is when I passed out. So, you know, we'll never know if it was an official cardiac arrest or the term in medicine is syncope, just, you know, passing out from that momentary loss of oxygenation. But when I woke up, I knew pretty much right away that I must have the same thing as my younger sister.
And it's a genetic condition, right? That's why your family all got tested once your sister found out?
That's right, it is a genetic condition. There is a form of long QT syndrome that is caused often by medications. So any normal person can take certain medications that might elongate the QT interval of their hearts. And so sometimes, especially with older adults who are on a lot of medications, you'll see people who have long QT syndrome or need to make decisions about their life as though they have long QT syndrome, but it's not the genetic version, it's from the medications. For those of us who have these genetic versions, you know, there's a number of them and they operate slightly different ways and have different triggers. Long QT syndrome type 1 tends to have a little bit more impact from physical activity, and type 3 tends to have a little bit more impact on sleep. People will have events actually while they're sleeping. Doesn't mean my sister or I couldn't have an event while we're sleeping, but when you run the data, the different mutations that genetic cardiologists have found sync up with these patterns of when that long QT begins getting long and then what types of events actually happen. So just because a QT interval is getting long does not mean that someone is automatically going into cardiac arrest. And that's part of what's hard to predict about it. But basically, there's just an increased likelihood that the heart could begin quivering instead of pumping blood when that interval starts getting long. And that would get sort of triggered by these external stimuli that we're talking about.
Okay, so you yourself were a pretty active person, and like you were saying, you were a ski instructor and you like love spending time in the mountains and camping and very much an outdoor active person. So how did you cope with, I guess, adjusting your lifestyle once you found out that you had this condition?
Honestly, I was devastated. And I think it's a part of why I didn't go in for testing sooner. I think I understood that if I did have this condition, my life as I knew it would be over. One thing I should say is that, you know, my sister and my initial treatments took place in 2007 and 2009. And what we know about long QT syndrome and how it gets treated is quite different now from what it was when we were diagnosed, and for the better. Essentially, there are a lot more tools in the toolbox to assess what the actual level of risk for any individual might be, and also to understand like different types of treatments and how they might be selected over one another to allow someone to still keep living the life that they love, right? The point of treating something like long QT syndrome is to not die. And in good medicine, I think we always have an eye on this question of like, how can patients be supported to still live a life that feels like they're living. So when I passed out in that parking lot and was literally earning my living through my body, and in particular with high risk activities that involve a lot of adrenaline and which involved being in the backcountry, meaning if I were skiing in a chute in the backcountry and I don't know, something startled me or something about the skiing triggered long QT syndrome and I passed out, I went into cardiac arrest, it would be very hard for me to be taken to medical care. The little hospital in Jackson Hole did not even have a cardiac unit or a cardiologist who worked there all the time. They had an ER and then a cardiologist who traveled to town, I think once every month to 6 weeks. It was sort of like circulating old time situation. And so it was just a really bad scenario. I understood that the life I had been living was probably not the life I could keep living, even if I felt comfortable. You know, my employers might not want to have an employee that had this kind of risk. I was responsible for other clients and really needed to be, needed to find my own body reliable. So I had a very confusing first summer with long QT syndrome because when I was diagnosed, the cardiologist said, I asked him straight up, I said, we've been very freaked out. I wanted to clarify with you, like, what exactly do we need to be afraid of? Like, what types of activities? And he said, basically everything. Which now, knowing so much more about long QT syndrome, was a terrible answer. But he told me I should probably never swim again. He told me light tennis and golf might be nice. I mean, he just was not noticing my stage of life or my career or like the actual questions that I was carrying. And one of the main treatments for long QT syndrome is beta blocker medication that holds the heart rate artificially low. And by holding the heart rate low, you prevent a lot of the opportunities for that very dangerous arrhythmia to develop. So beta blockers were effective at keeping me safe, but beta blockers, they're vasodilators. They keep your blood pressure pretty low. And I already being as fit as I was, had a very low blood pressure. So it really dropped my blood pressure almost to unmanageable levels. Every time I stood up, I was spinning. I was just really unable to go about my normal everyday activities. I couldn't ride my bike downtown. I couldn't be sexually active with my partner. And so I lived in this weird space of like, I don't want to give up these things I love. And these things I love are how I manage hard experiences in life, like to not be able to go for a run, to not be able to spend time in the wild, to not be able to be alone. I'm an introvert. I like spending time alone, and I thought I might die if I was alone. So, and then to like go for a hike and take that risk, but feel myself lightheaded, feel a little dizzy, have to sit down, and not know whether that was the heart condition itself or the beta blocker medication. So, I can't underscore enough that the experience a person has of something genetic like long QT syndrome is going to have everything to do with what kind of treatment they're given. And that means the treatment, not only in terms of like which drug and in what amount and introduced in what way, but also the types of support that their cardiologist is able to give them, the way that their life is actually taken into account as part of that treatment. And their questions are answered in ways that allow for a feeling of some safety.
Have you found the developments in the genetic sphere that have been happening over the last, say, 5 years or so have really impacted the knowledge around your condition in particular?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's most exciting to watch is the way, currently there is a genetic test you can get that tells you, okay, you do have a mutation in this area. It is type 2. But I think what geneticists have been learning is that just because you have a particular mutation, just because you have a gene, doesn't mean it will express itself. And it doesn't tell us how it will express itself. And long QT syndrome is fascinating in that people in the same family have the same gene, and the way they end up living out the story of that gene is so different. Some people, it never expresses itself. And there are a lot of factors at play there. You know, androgen is a protective factor. And so in my family, there was a great-great-grandmother in 1899 named Lena Proctor. She was in Hamilton, Texas, and she died at age 20, right after giving birth to my great-grandfather. And we think that she had long QT syndrome. Her death sort of mirrored what you would expect to see from a long QT patient. Early onset death, unexplained. You know, there was sort of a sense that she'd had a quote unquote heart attack, which back then medicine had not yet distinguished between heart attacks and cardiac arrest. And long QT syndrome, you can be highly at risk during pregnancy or postpartum. So we really trace this back to Lena Proctor and suspect that she is part of our story. But she gave birth to one son, and my great-grandfather also only had one son, and my grandfather had 4 sons, one of whom is my father. And among those 4 boys, we now know that my father carries this gene, and one uncle also carries the gene. But they never had any trouble. It never expressed itself. And the question of why that would be is part of what medicine can start teasing out for us through research. And then even between my sister and I, her long QT syndrome was much more active. She has actually had her life saved by her implanted cardiac defibrillator, whereas mine, I no longer take beta blocker medication, and my device has never gone off. And one of the cool things about having that device in my body is that it's always watching my heartbeat. So if any arrhythmias did occur, it would be recording them. And so we would know how often that was occurring and when it was occurring, and it's not occurring. So the question of like, why did I pass out in a parking lot that day in 2009 when I now am living a life where this arrhythmia is just not showing up? And is that due to lifestyle factors? Is that due to other mitigating genes that I have? Is it just that at that time I passed out, I had a particular type of overwhelming stress that sort of tipped something over the edge? So genetics research is able to start looking at not just the presence of one gene, but how that gene relates to maybe other features of someone's makeup. And there's also a lot of research coming out that differentiates the different beta blockers and some non-beta blocker drugs that I'm not as familiar with, truth be told, but that are starting to be useful in the treatment. And then there's a lot more knowledge around sympathetic denervations, this idea that you can do a small denervation procedure inside the heart that certainly carries its own risk, but might remove enough of the risk of long QT overall that then someone who's having trouble with medications, say, could live their life without medications or without a defibrillator. And so if we're going to personalize the way we treat long QT syndrome to really allow individual people to live the best lives possible within their set of circumstances, dialing in all those different factors and having more information is just so essential.
It's really fascinating how much science can advance in such a short time, really, and all the differences that it can make. But I was curious, beyond like pharmaceutical interventions and medical device interventions, are there lifestyle things that you can do to support your condition? Like, for example, we know that magnesium is essential to proper muscle function. The heart is obviously a muscle within the body. So if you're ensuring you get enough magnesium and other essential nutrients like that, can that help to mitigate your risk as well?
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of those things that I should add a little caveat that it's possible that the research has shifted even since I was last sort of digging around in it. For type 2 in particular, it is suggested that we take potassium supplements and generally remaining really well hydrated, really paying attention to electrolytes, like not giving the heart any extra imbalance that might tip an already long QT over the edge. Obviously, I was already talking about the drugs that can elongate the QT interval further. And it's very important that long QT patients pay attention to what drugs are on that list and really make careful choices about when to employ them. It is a huge list. There's actually a whole app called Credible Meds that the long QT community has developed that I'm so grateful for, because then whenever any new research comes out, it gets updated in the app. And so if you're in an office with a different medical practitioner and they're trying to prescribe you something, you can be the one who looks it up right then and right there. Some of the examples of drugs that I have not been able to take because they would increase my risk profile too much are like ADHD medications, which I would really love to use as a writer, not gonna lie. But things like Ritalin and Adderall are too dangerous for long QT type 2. And I also, when I travel to the African continent, I do not take anti-malarials. My doctors have specified that were I to get malaria, it would then be worth the risk of employing an anti-malarial in the treatment like quinine. But up front, it's not worth the risk of walking around with an elongated QT for, however many weeks I'm traveling. And so the lifestyle choices there are things like, well, you could not travel to Africa, but as readers will know, this book takes place partially on the African continent, so that was pretty important to me. But, are you using your mosquito nets when you're traveling there? Are you carrying rain pants and a raincoat so that in jungle areas you have sort of an impenetrable layer around you? Do you have high quality anti-mosquito sprays, that kind of stuff? In sort of a everyday life sense, one of the factors that researchers have really been trying to figure out is how exercise maps onto these different types. Obviously, exercise is very important for heart health overall. And it used to be that if you got a long QT diagnosis, especially as a kid, you would just be yanked off all your sports teams. And I think what we're learning is that it's not that simple, that there may be ways, again, with watching the medications to avoid. You can't take normal things like a lot of cold medicines, so you just have to be aware. Perhaps supporting schools in having external defibrillators hanging by every field or available at every event. There are certain types of exercise that can be, especially for type 2 like myself, a little bit more dangerous. Sprinting, that's obviously about a burst of adrenaline, versus sort of like the long distance, more plodding running. So doing sprinting events on a swim team is going to be really different from signing up for a really long relay race. And so there are some slight choices like that that people can choose to make. And beyond that, my doctors and I have had very frank conversations about ways of supporting the parasympathetic nervous system. So the part of our nervous system that down regulates threat or stress. Like, how do we improve the body's ability to bounce back from the types of ongoing strain that keep the QT long? And there's just not that many of us who have long QT syndrome and who perhaps are doing yoga specifically or using acupuncture weekly for those long-term studies to have been done. But I will say that I notice an extraordinary difference in how much palpitating I feel from my heart when I'm doing a lot of parasympathetic nervous system strengtheners. So Qigong, body work. There's just a lot of ways to support a body in regulating itself. That's not to say that by doing yoga or doing acupuncture, you're not going to have a dangerous arrhythmia from your long QT. That's the level where we don't know how the pieces add up, but we do know that all of these pieces are worth thinking about as a combined risk management system.
That's awesome that there's lots of different options and pieces that you can put together to create your own picture based on where you're at in your life and your condition and that sort of thing. Now, I was curious if you found writing your book therapeutic in your process of dealing with your diagnosis and coming to terms with it and learning about it.
Yeah, I had a really interesting moment right when the book came out. A reporter for the Jackson Hole News and Guide, in advance of one of my events, she clearly hadn't read the book, and she said, "What was your favorite part of writing the book?" And I had this huge pause because I was like, wow, favorite part. Like, this was a really hard book to write. And I found myself standing there just thinking, I'm not sure this was fun. And so the connotations of the word therapeutic, ultimately the outcome is good, right? Is a kind of soothing, a moving from one place to another. Things that are therapeutic are supportive and helpful to us. But anyone who's really been in a deep therapy process knows that that is ugly, dark, hard work. And this book was very much a process that required that I show up to my own spiritual growth. I certainly carried a lot of trauma from the events of the book, which include, not only passing out in that parking lot at 24, but when that happened, I was uninsured and thought I was going to die every day for 5 months while I tried to figure out how to get the device. And then I had the surgery and had to recover from that surgery, which, as a young person, I think had more impact on me than I knew. And the book also talks about going septic about 6 months after, so having a bacterial blood infection that was really becoming dangerous. I was at risk of having some organs shut down. I had a blood clot in my lung. Later in the story, I take some accidental shocks to the heart. And then kind of near the end of the book, I learned that one of my wires is broken. And in the process of trying to remove that wire, it snaps off and becomes something that is currently living in my body that I can't remove today and have to just sort of be on notice that there will come a day that it probably will be urgent to remove it. So there were a lot of surgeries, there were a lot of life transitions, there were a lot of just what it means to be young and be aware of death in that way and have it affect your relationships. And working within the American medical system was extremely traumatic, and having to face that and tell that story. So I like to say that I basically did trauma writing for 2 years straight, and every story that was in my body that I was sort of carrying around the way we do when things have happened to us, I had to move it back out. I had to run it through me in order to get it on the page. And you can't rush that. It really requires the skills of sitting deeply with what that experience was and feeling everything that needs to be felt. And so it wasn't even so much like cognitive behavioral talk therapy to make that happen, although that was certainly important in places. It was this experience of like, in order to write about my traumatic surgery, I had to bring up a YouTube video of some of the things that happened in that surgery so that I could describe them appropriately. But to watch something like that when you have been traumatized by it is really difficult. And so I would press play and then watch for a few seconds. And as soon as I had just overwhelming experience in my body, I would press pause and I would have to just be with whatever was there, breathing deeply into it. Sometimes screaming, sometimes twitching, sometimes, deep breathing and big naps, walking around. Just how does this thing need to move through me and what do I have to do in order to let it do so? And it was a very slow, hard process. But I can tell you that last summer, when I finally turned in my copy edits to the publisher, within weeks, my body started changing. It was like a literal weight that I'd been carrying started falling off me, and my whole face looked different. It was like my eyes became alive again. So yes, I do think it was a therapeutic process. But I don't ever want to undersell sort of what that asked of me. And it is something that I carry as knowledge when I talk to other people who have long QT syndrome or who have implanted cardiac defibrillators, who've been through surgeries, especially as young people, that there may be a lot of things they are carrying unprocessed in their bodies that affect their experience of the world all the time in ways that they're not even aware of. And I just have so much deep empathy for all of us living in a world where we move so fast that we don't always have time to sit and be with our conditions and really give them processing space.
Well, I will say I find your writing hauntingly beautiful in that it is very, I think you convey your emotion and what you're going through in a way that the reader can absorb and can empathize with, even if they haven't gone through it. And I think
Mhm.
that you do a great job of marrying your own personal journey and experience with the technical knowledge someone needs to be able to understand what it is that you've gone through and what others who have the condition may have also experienced. So that's just my
Mhm.
personal take on your book,
Thank
but I
you
do
so
think it's beautiful in a, like you say, challenging way.
much. Yeah, well, I learned very early that you can't keep a reader's attention through so much trauma unless it's beautiful. And I think I also can't live through it unless it's beautiful in some way. So beauty is very strategic and essential to existing within that kind of storyline.
Now, the other overarching question that you explored in your book is what if a life-saving medical device causes loss of life along its supply chain, which I think is a really interesting and altruistic outlook for someone who's already grappling with her own mortality and dealing with her own complete overhaul of her life. Can you share a bit about your process of exploring this and what made you even start to go down that road?
Yeah, so on a yeah, so that part of the book really felt like something I didn't choose so much as was drafted into or it landed in me. So the book opens, as you know, with a prologue in which I'm playing intramural soccer at grad school. It's an evening game. Some guy on the other team has fallen and he's getting up, so the game is stopped. And all of the sudden, I feel like my spine has been kicked in. And it takes me a moment to realize I'm being shocked by my defibrillator while awake. And of course, as I said earlier, that defibrillator was implanted because it has the power to reverse life-threatening arrhythmias that would normally cause me to go into cardiac arrest or die. But when that happens, normally you're not conscious. You've already passed out, and then the defibrillator acts like the paddles in the ER and delivers a shock of electricity that sort of allows the heartbeat to flatline and then reestablish itself more normally. And that wasn't happening. I was awake. And so it was very unnerving. I took one shock, 850 volts, and then I took another. And then by the third one, it was like, oh my God, is this going to stop? And luckily, I started deep breathing, and that took my heart rate, which had been high from the soccer game, below a certain threshold, and it did stop shocking me. But as I was lying on the soccer field after taking those shocks, honestly smelling my own burned tissues, I just kept finding myself thinking, if that saved my life, was it worth it? If it saved my life, I found myself thinking specifically of conflict mineral scenarios in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I must have heard about earlier that year for it to be floating around in my brain waiting to land. But in that conflict mineral scenario, the electronics boom in the US had made it very lucrative for armed groups in Central Africa to take over these mines and force people to work and actually, keep women as sex slaves, use the weapons they were able to buy with the proceeds to terrorize nearby villages. Congo was known as the rape capital of the world during that era. 2012 is when I was shocked and when conflict minerals in Congo were sort of at crisis level. So Yeah, this landed in my body and it was so weird. I can't even tell you. I was certainly the kind of person who would have such a thought. I already was a person who tried to buy my clothes from used sources or environmentally friendly sources. I shopped at the farmers market. So I was thinking about supply chains, but the way it landed in me just felt like something that I was being tasked to follow. And when I look back at it now, you can see even in early parts of my story, there's a period where I'm staying in this hotel in Boulder, Colorado. I've just quit my life in Wyoming and moved to Colorado to try to get this heart surgery by becoming a Colorado resident. And I almost killed myself in that hotel room. And there was a real question that I was living without totally being able to identify it around what a human life is worth, uh, period. Like, why would mine be saved? Why would mine not be saved? Why should I want to live if I know I can die and we can all die at any moment? There was just a lot packed in there that it took me years to untangle. And I feel very grateful to have had that seed planted in me in 2012, because on the one hand, these are unanswerable questions. They are deeply human, enormous questions that can never quite be cracked. And I think I'm in a process of learning that I deserve to be alive, that resources are not wasted on me. And at the same time, we do have a sort of blind privilege in the West and in America in particular, in which we think that just because something is deemed a life-saving treatment doesn't mean it doesn't carry extraordinary costs. And part of what my book is about is that, I may never have needed my defibrillator in the first place. My long QT may be totally treatable without it. And so those resources would then, quote unquote, be wasted on me in some sense. And so this question of like remembering that we are hooked to other ecosystems on the other side of the world, we are hooked to other human and plant communities that we actually need, especially the plant communities. We need those ecosystems to be doing work for our planet that benefits all of us. And so it's not without cost to save a life through a high-end technological intervention. And I just really needed to do that math. And what I can say again is that the answer really doesn't exist. And there are a lot of small things we can do, which I point out, especially in the epilogue of the book, around tightening up our supply chains and, as Americans, starting to engage with the way our relationship to death often means just hemorrhaging every resource we can get our hands on, when having a different relationship to death, there may actually be treatments that are just as good, or it may be time to no longer treat certain conditions. We may be at a certain point in our life where that's right and good, where then those resources would not be so blindly employed. So it's a really complicated question, and I'm glad you spoke to it.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I am so excited to finish the rest of your book. I've been hanging on every word so far, and I really appreciate that you took the time to chat with me and explore from your own point of view this condition and all that comes with it for people. For the listeners, if you'd like to learn more about Catherine's book, you can find information on her website at catherinestanford.com. Thank you so much for joining me today, Catherine.
Thank you so much for having me on and for making this available to folks who might be living with long QT syndrome or curious about it or knowing someone who has it.
Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic or email us